A judge fined a royal guard for disrupting court in costume, thinking he was just there for show. But then the guard spoke, and within moments the judge realised he'd just picked a fight with a Cambridge-trained legal expert. What happened next left the courtroom in stunned silence. Now, before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow at this very same time we're dropping another powerful Royal Guard story that you won't want to miss. The autumn sunlight glinted off the brass buttons of Lieutenant Malcolm Reynolds's scarlet tunic as he navigated the busy streets of London's legal district. His polished boots echoed against the pavement with each precise step, creating a steady rhythm that matched his disciplined thoughts. The weight of his bearskin cap, a full 13 inches tall, had long ago ceased to register on his consciousness after 7 years with the King's Guard. Reynolds checked his watch, a simple, sturdy timepiece that had been his father's. 90 minutes until his ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace. His route today took him past the Old Bailey, and the magnificent building with its golden Lady Justice statue had always fascinated him. Perhaps it was the shared sense of tradition between the legal system and military ceremony that drew him to both worlds. The courthouse stood as a monument to order and justice, not unlike the disciplined ranks he now served in. Reynolds had grown up with stories of both institutions. His father, a respected barrister, his grandfather, a decorated military officer. He'd walked a path between these worlds his entire life, finding value in both the intellectual rigour of law and the physical discipline of military service. Few of his fellow guardsmen knew about his legal education. He kept that part of himself private, finding satisfaction in simply serving without showcasing his credentials. Plenty of time, he murmured to himself, slowing his pace as he approached the courthouse steps. A public hearing was in session, something about a property dispute he'd read about in yesterday's paper. His interest in law wasn't merely casual. Before joining the Guard, he'd harboured ambitions in that direction, spending countless evening hours studying legal texts and following landmark cases. Several passers-by slowed their hurried London pace as they noticed him. A businessman nodded respectfully. 2 tourists whispered excitedly and fumbled for their cameras before thinking better of it. An elderly man with a veteran's pin on his lapel caught Reynolds's eye and offered a crisp salute. Reynolds returned it with perfect precision, the gesture carrying the weight of shared service across generations. "Going on duty, lad?" the veteran asked. "Not for another hour and a half, sir," Reynolds replied with a slight smile. "Thought I might observe the Webster hearing inside." The veteran nodded approvingly. "Educational use of your time. Carry on." As Reynolds climbed the courthouse steps, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with the uniform. Even off duty, he represented something larger than himself, a tradition of discipline and service stretching back centuries. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 6 opened silently under Reynolds's white-gloved hand. Inside, the wood-panelled room buzzed with the subdued energy of legal proceedings in progress. Reynolds slipped through the doorway with military efficiency, his movements precise but quiet as he sought to minimize any disruption. Despite his care, the vibrant scarlet of his uniform created a stark contrast against the courtroom's muted palette of greys, blacks, and dark woods. At the bench sat Judge Harold Blackwood, a man whose reputation preceded him in legal circles. In his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and gold-rimmed spectacles, Blackwood cut an impressive figure in his judicial robes. He was currently presiding over what appeared to be the final stages of a property dispute, his resonant voice filling the chamber as he questioned the plaintiff's counsel. "And you expect this court to believe," Blackwood was saying, his words carrying the practiced projection of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own authority, "that your client was unaware of the easement, despite it being clearly documented in the original deed?" The solicitor shifted uncomfortably. "My client maintains that the document provided during the sale did not—" Yes, Blackwood interrupted with a dismissive wave. "We've heard that particular claim already." His eyes swept the courtroom with the satisfaction of a conductor before an orchestra, clearly relishing his command of the proceedings. Reynolds located an empty seat in the back row and maneuvered into it with minimal disturbance. The bench creaked softly beneath him, the only sound marking his arrival. Still, the crimson uniform inevitably drew attention. A young law clerk glanced back, did a double take, then nudged her colleague. Soon, a subtle wave of whispers and turned heads rippled through the gallery. Judge Blackwood, deep into what was clearly a well-rehearsed judicial monologue, suddenly realized he had lost his audience. His voice trailed off as he followed the collective gaze to the scarlet-uniformed figure sitting quietly in the back row. The abrupt silence amplified the shift in attention. In his 27 years on the bench, Blackwood had cultivated his courtroom persona with meticulous care. He was known throughout the London legal community for his sharp intellect and sharper tongue, a reputation that preceded him in whispered conversations among nervous barristers, preparing to appear before him for the first time. He'd established himself as the centre of gravity in any proceeding he oversaw. Until now. The uniform, that bright, unmistakable scarlet, had diverted attention from him without a word being spoken. It was a sensation Judge Blackwood was unaccustomed to, and one he found deeply unsettling. "Is there," Blackwood asked, his voice cutting through the silence with deliberate precision, "something of interest occurring in the gallery that supersedes the matter before this court?" The question hung in the air, ostensibly directed at everyone, yet aimed unmistakably at the guardsman whose presence had disrupted the carefully cultivated atmosphere of judicial theatre. The sharp crack of his gavel silenced the murmurs that had filled the courtroom. "May I ask," Blackwood began, his voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt, "why a costumed performer has decided it appropriate to disrupt my courtroom in the middle of proceedings?" The question landed like a physical blow in the hushed room. Several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, embarrassed by the judge's open hostility toward a member of the King's Guard. Reynolds remained still for a moment, then rose to his feet with military precision. "Your Honour," he responded, his voice clear but respectful, "Lieutenant Malcolm Reynolds of the King's Guard. I am attending as an interested citizen during my off-duty hours." The judge's eyebrows rose dramatically. An interested citizen who chose to attend in full theatrical regalia rather than civilian attire. Interesting interpretation of courtroom decorum, Lieutenant. The court clerk glanced up from her notes, her expression betraying concern at the judge's tone. Across the room, the bailiff straightened his posture slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interaction was taking. "The uniform is standard duty attire, Your Honour," Reynolds explained evenly. "I am due at my post at Buckingham Palace directly after this hearing." Blackwood scoffed audibly. "And you couldn't have found time to change between engagements? Or perhaps the spectacle of appearing in costume was part of your intention in coming here today?" A silver-haired barrister in the front row cleared his throat. "Your Honour, perhaps we might return to the Westbury property matter. My client has another appointment at—" "One moment, Mr. Harrington," Blackwood cut him off without taking his eyes off Reynolds. "The dignity of this court is my primary concern. When someone enters my courtroom dressed for a tourist photo opportunity, it undermines the serious nature of these proceedings." Reynolds stood at perfect attention, his expression betraying nothing of the indignation he might have felt at having his uniform described as a costume. "Your Honour, with respect, this is a public hearing. Citizens are permitted to observe regardless of profession or attire." Blackwood's face flushed slightly at the measured response. "I'm well aware of the public nature of these proceedings, Lieutenant. I've only been presiding over them for 27 years. His sarcasm drew uncomfortable glances from the legal professionals present. "What you seem unaware of," the judge continued, leaning forward over his bench, "is that this courtroom operates under specific decorum requirements. Section 42 of Courtroom Procedural Standards clearly prohibits attire that creates distraction or disruption. The elderly solicitor in the front row furrowed his brow at this citation, exchanging a puzzled glance with his colleague. Reynolds noted their reaction, but maintained his respectful stance. Judge Blackwood pushed himself to his feet, looming over the courtroom from his elevated position. His judicial robes billowed slightly with the movement, adding to his theatrical bearing. "In my 30 years on this bench," he announced, "I have never witnessed such blatant disrespect for these proceedings. The uniform of the King's Guard belongs on palace grounds and ceremonial routes. Not in a court of law where serious matters are being decided. This isn't a tourist attraction, Lieutenant." Several spectators exchanged uncomfortable glances. The property dispute that had originally occupied the court sat forgotten, its participants watching the unfolding drama with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Section 42 of Courtroom Procedural Standards," Blackwood repeated with growing emphasis, "explicitly prohibits performance attire in judicial settings." He thumped a thick legal volume on the bench for emphasis, though he made no move to open it to the purported section. Reynolds remained composed, but decided one final clarification was necessary. "Your Honour, with respect, there is no prohibition against military uniforms in any courtroom standard I'm aware of, the Judicial Access Act specifically." "You presume to lecture me on court procedure?" Blackwood cut him off, his voice sharp enough to make the court clerk flinch. "I determine what is and isn't appropriate in my courtroom, soldier, not you." The dismissive tone with which he said "soldier" carried unmistakable disdain, transforming the honourable designation into something approaching an insult. Several of the legal professionals present shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognising the judge had crossed a line. "What we have here," the judge continued, "is a clear case of someone using theatrical dress to draw attention to themselves in my courtroom. I wonder, Lieutenant, do you find your actual duties so lacking in substance that you need to seek validation by disrupting legal proceedings?" The personal attack hung in the air, shocking in its nakedness. The court reporter's fingers momentarily hesitated over her machine before resuming their work, capturing the increasingly inappropriate remarks for the official record. Reynolds remained perfectly composed, though the slightest tightening around his eyes suggested the insult had registered. "I'm here to observe the application of civil procedure in a property dispute, Your Honour. Nothing more." "Playing dress-up while you do it," Blackwood scoffed. "Tell me, does the palace know you're using their costume to seek attention elsewhere?" Judge Blackwood shuffled the papers before him with deliberate theatricality, making a show of consulting legal references that no one in the room believed he was actually reading. The performance was clearly meant to convey judicial deliberation, though his mind had evidently been made up moments ago. "Lieutenant, if that is indeed your rank," he began, infusing the title with just enough scepticism to make his disrespect clear, "you leave me no choice in this matter." He straightened to his full height, squaring his shoulders beneath his judicial robes. "For willful disruption of court proceedings and inappropriate attire in a judicial setting, I am imposing a fine of £2,000 to be paid within 14 days. A ripple of disbelief ran through the courtroom. The amount was wildly disproportionate for any kind of procedural violation, let alone one so clearly manufactured. The court clerk's eyebrows shot up in visible surprise, though she quickly composed her features into professional neutrality. "Additionally," Blackwood continued, warming to his theme, "I am citing you for uniform violation in a judicial setting contra Section 38 of the Courthouse Attendance Regulations." Two junior barristers near the back exchanged alarmed glances. One leaned toward the other, whispering just loudly enough to be heard by those nearby. "Can he actually do that?" His colleague shook her head slightly, her expression troubled. "There is no Section 38. He's completely overreaching." Reynolds stood perfectly still throughout this pronouncement, his military bearing unaltered by the unjust penalty being imposed. When the judge finally paused, he spoke. "Your Honour, I respectfully request permission to address the court regarding this matter. You've said quite enough, Lieutenant, Blackwood replied dismissively. The fine stands. Court security will provide you with the necessary documentation on your way out. He made a shooing motion with his hand, as if dismissing a servant. From the front row, an older barrister with silver hair and the quiet dignity that comes from decades of respected practice rose to his feet. Your Honour, if I might speak to a point of procedure. Blackwood glared at the interruption, but the barrister's seniority and reputation made him difficult to dismiss. What is it, Mr. Harrington? Basic procedural fairness requires that the lieutenant be permitted to respond to the charges before penalties are imposed, Harrington stated calmly. It's a fundamental principle of natural justice. Other legal professionals in the gallery nodded in agreement, emboldened by the senior barrister's intervention. Blackwood glanced around the courtroom, suddenly aware that his behaviour had crossed from merely petty into potentially reviewable territory. Very well, he conceded with poor grace. Lieutenant Reynolds may make a brief statement, though I doubt it will alter the outcome. Reynolds stepped forward into the centre aisle with measured military precision. He came to attention, removed his bearskin cap and tucked it properly under his left arm in accordance with military protocol for speaking indoors. The simple dignity of the movement stood in sharp contrast to the judge's theatrical displays. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even those who had been whispering among themselves turned their full attention to the scarlet uniformed figure now standing in perfect military bearing before the bench. The atmosphere had changed. Where moments before there had been discomfort at the judge's behaviour, now there was anticipation. Something in Reynolds's confident posture suggested that what would follow would be worth hearing. A court reporter would later describe this moment to colleagues at a pub. It was like watching a duel begin, but only one person had a sword and the other didn't know it yet. The property dispute litigants, forgotten until now, leaned forward in their seats as invested in this unexpected drama as everyone else present. Thank you, Your Honour, Reynolds began, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom without seeming to be raised. Reynolds's 7 years of calling commands across parade grounds had trained his voice to project without strain. I must respectfully correct several factual and legal errors in Your Honour's assessment. First, regarding public attendance at court hearings, he continued, the Court Access Act of 1981, Section 4, Paragraph 2, explicitly states that no citizen shall be barred from observing public court proceedings based on profession, attire or appearance, provided their conduct remains non-disruptive. Reynolds quoted the statute verbatim without hesitation or reference to notes. Judge Blackwood's expression flickered briefly with uncertainty. The Act further clarifies in paragraph 3 that military personnel in uniform are explicitly permitted to observe proceedings during off-duty hours. This provision was added following Morris v. Sutton District Court, 1979, where a naval officer was improperly removed from a public hearing. Reynolds reached into his tunic pocket and produced a small, well-worn legal reference book. I have the relevant sections here, if the court wishes to verify the citation. Regarding the Section 42 of Courtroom Procedural Standards that Your Honour cited, Reynolds continued, I must note that the standards contain only 37 sections, as revised in March of last year. There is no Section 42. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every word. Similarly, the Section 38 of Courthouse Attendance Regulations, mentioned in connection with the fine, does not exist in any current legal framework governing British courts. Judge Blackwood shifted in his seat, colour rising in his cheeks. While the specific section numbers may differ from my recollection, he interjected, the principle remains. With respect, Your Honour, Reynolds continued with calm precision, the principle does not remain, as no such prohibitions exist in any form. The Judicial Administration Act of 2005 specifically prohibited arbitrary dress codes for public attendees at open court sessions, following several cases where judges had attempted to impose personal preferences as legal requirements. As to the matter of the fine itself, Reynolds said, his pace measured and methodical, the Judicial Penalties Act of 2007, Section 14, explicitly limits monetary sanctions to instances of actual disruption, defined as behaviour that tangibly impedes the function of the court. My silent observation from the public gallery does not meet this standard. Judge Blackwood's hand, which had been reaching for his water glass, paused in mid-air. "You seem remarkably well versed in legal matters for a ceremonial guard, Lieutenant," he observed, attempting to regain his footing. "That brings me to an important point of clarification," Reynolds replied, his posture remaining perfectly formal. "At this point, I should perhaps explain my background to provide context for my observations." He stood at perfect military attention, the scarlet tunic adding gravity to his words. "Before joining the King's Guard 5 years ago, I completed my law degree at Cambridge University, graduating with first-class honours and specialising in administrative and constitutional law." Audible gasps emerged from several points in the gallery. Judge Blackwood's face drained of colour, his earlier confidence evaporating as the full extent of his miscalculation became apparent. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bench, as if anchoring himself against a sudden storm. The courtroom he had controlled with such easy authority minutes earlier now felt like foreign territory. One junior barrister stifled a smile behind his hand, his eyes alive with the unexpected theatre. A senior solicitor in pinstripes raised an eyebrow in professional appreciation, not of the judge's discomfort, but of the precise legal reasoning delivered by the most unexpected source imaginable. Near the back, a law student on courthouse observation feverishly scribbled notes, instinctively recognizing a moment worth remembering for her future career. Judge Blackwood swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly as the carefully constructed facade of his authority began crumbling before a courtroom of witnesses. He'd built his reputation on encyclopedic knowledge of the law and judicial temperament, both now being systematically dismantled by a man he'd dismissed as a costumed performer. "I practiced for 3 years with Harrington, Whitfield and Associates, focusing primarily on cases involving procedural justice and administrative overreach. Currently, I'm completing a part-time master's degree in legal history through King's College London, with particular focus on the evolution of courtroom access rights." The court reporter's fingers paused momentarily over her machine before resuming their work with renewed vigour, capturing every word of the extraordinary revelation. "This background informs my assessment of today's proceedings," Reynolds continued calmly. "In particular, I would direct the court's attention to Andrews v. Judicial Services Commission, 2014, where Justice Whitmore wrote that the imposition of arbitrary fines based on a judge's personal discomfort rather than actual disruption constitutes a profound misapplication of judicial authority. The characterization of military dress uniform as costume or theatrical dress also raises concerns beyond mere inaccuracy," Reynolds continued. "In Martins v. Bedford Crown Court, 2008, the Appellate Division ruled that judicial disparagement of military service constitutes improper conduct worthy of review. Justice Lawrence specifically noted that the uniform represents service to the Crown and nation, demanding the same respect in legal settings that judges expect for their own robes." Judge Blackwood's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench. "This theatrical display doesn't change the fact that your presence has disrupted my courtroom," he attempted, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "With respect, Your Honour," Reynolds replied firmly, "the only disruption occurred when you halted legitimate proceedings to address my silent observation from the public gallery. The transcript will reflect that I entered quietly, sat without comment, and caused no disturbance until directly addressed by the bench." Your Honour's characterisation of my professional attire as playing dress-up not only mischaracterises the nature of military service, but potentially violates Judicial Canon 3 regarding respect for essential government functions, Reynolds noted. The Judicial Conduct Investigations Office has previously reviewed similar comments in Hendricks v North London Court, finding that disparagement of military or police uniforms by judicial officers undermines public confidence in the mutual respect essential between branches of government. In summary, Reynolds concluded, his posture and tone remaining respectful despite the devastating legal critique he had delivered. The fine imposed is without legal foundation based on non-existent regulations and imposed in response to permitted conduct. The characterization of my uniform and presence represents a significant departure from established legal norms regarding military personnel and public court access. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent courtroom. His fingers adjusted his robes in a transparent attempt to regain composure, but the gesture only emphasized his discomfort. In light of the additional information presented, he began, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of error, this court will reconsider the matter of the fine. He shuffled papers needlessly, clearly stalling as he formulated his retreat. The citation is hereby withdrawn, and no penalty will be assessed. Lieutenant Reynolds remained at attention, his expression revealing nothing of what must have been a sense of vindication. Thank you, Your Honour. However, with respect, a formal correction to the record would be appropriate given the nature of the exchange. The request hung in the air, its reasonable tone making it impossible to dismiss without appearing petty. The court clerk slid a discreet note onto the judge's bench, a lifeline of professional advice in increasingly treacherous waters. Blackwood glanced at the note, his lips tightening briefly before he spoke again. The record will reflect that Lieutenant Reynolds was within his rights to attend these proceedings and that no violation of court protocol occurred. The words emerged stiffly, each one seeming to cost him considerable effort. Furthermore, he added after another glance at the clerk's note, the court acknowledges that previous characterizations of the lieutenant's uniform were inappropriate. The King's Guard represents a distinguished tradition of service to the Crown. Reynolds nodded once, accepting the grudging apology with military dignity. Thank you, Your Honour. I appreciate the court's reconsideration. He prepared to depart when the judge's gavel stopped him. Lieutenant, Blackwood called, making one final attempt to salvage his authority. While your legal knowledge is, admittedly impressive, in future court appearances, perhaps consider that military presence can be distracting in civilian proceedings. Reynolds turned back, facing the bench directly. Your Honour, the uniform I wear represents hundreds of years of service and sacrifice. The law you administer promises equal access to justice for all citizens, regardless of profession. These traditions are not in conflict, they reinforce each other. A society that respects both will be stronger for it. The simple eloquence of this statement resonated through the courtroom. Several spectators nodded in agreement, including the elderly barrister who had spoken earlier. The court appreciates your perspective, Lieutenant, Blackwood conceded, recognizing further argument would only diminish him further. You are free to remain for the proceedings or depart as your duties require. Reynolds checked his watch with military precision. Thank you, Your Honour. I should report for my post. I apologize for any unintended disruption to today's hearing. With that final courtesy, offering an apology that everyone present knew was unnecessary, Reynolds replaced his bearskin cap with perfect form and executed a precise military turn toward the exit. His departure was as composed and dignified as his defence had been, each step measured and exact against the wooden floor. In the lobby, Reynolds found the elderly veteran who had saluted him earlier waiting by the entrance. The old soldier came to attention as best his aged frame allowed and offered another salute. Saw the whole thing through the door, the veteran said quietly. Reminded them what it means to wear the uniform, you did. Well done, son. Reynolds returned the salute with perfect form. "Thank you, sir. Just did what was necessary." He checked his watch again, still sufficient time to reach his post at Buckingham Palace. As he descended the courthouse steps, his bearing remained perfectly military, shoulders square, head high. The encounter had not altered his composure or his schedule, discipline maintained in the face of both injustice and vindication. What would you do if someone in authority tried to use their position to humiliate or intimidate you? Lieutenant Reynolds' story reminds us that true strength comes not from rank or title, but from knowledge, composure, and the quiet confidence that comes from being in the right. Behind the ceremonial uniform that Judge Blackwood mocked stood a man of exceptional intelligence and principle, qualities that ultimately revealed the judge's own shortcomings. Sometimes the people we're quickest to dismiss, based on appearances, are the very ones who have the most to teach us about integrity and respect. Now, if this story made you think about the importance of standing up to unfair treatment with knowledge rather than anger, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about royal guards and the values they represent. Press the bell icon to never miss our uploads, and check out the other videos appearing on your screen right now. Have you ever been underestimated because of appearances or stereotypes about your profession? Or have you witnessed someone handle unfair treatment with exceptional grace and intelligence? Share your experiences in the comments below. We read every one and would love to hear your thoughts. We'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with another brand new Royal Guard story you won't want to miss.